Booster Gold #1, from the future for fame. In the glittering, technologically advanced world of the 25th century, life seemed perfect on the surface. Cities floated above the clouds, crime was rare, and technology solved most problems before they even happened. But perfection had a shadow, and for one man, that shadow was failure. His name was Michael Booster Gold #1, from the future for fame. In the glittering, technologically advanced world of the 25th century, life seemed perfect on the surface. Cities floated above the clouds, crime was rare, and technology solved most problems before they even happened. But perfection had a shadow, and for one man, that shadow was failure. His name was Michael John. Booster Gold #1, from the future for fame. In the glittering, technologically advanced world of the 25th century, life seemed perfect on the surface. Cities floated above the clouds, crime was rare, and technology solved most problems before they even happened. But perfection had a shadow, and for one man, that shadow was failure. His name was Michael John Carter. Most people in the city knew him as a promising athlete, one of the greatest quarterbacks ever to play in the Interplanetary Football League. Stadiums filled with cheering fans whenever he stepped onto the field. Commentators talked about his speed, his instincts, his future. But Michael John Carter had a problem. He wanted more than success. He wanted glory. At night, while the rest of the city slept, Michael would stare out over the glowing skyline of Gotham City in the 25th century. Hover cars zipped through the air, digital billboards lit up the sky, and Michael thought about how small he still felt. Football fame wasn't enough. He wanted to be remembered forever. Unfortunately, ambition mixed with desperation can lead to terrible choices. One night, Michael made the biggest mistake of his life. Gamblers had approached him earlier in the season. Quiet offers, large sums of money. All he had to do was shave a few points, throw a pass a little off target, lose a game here or there. At first, he refused, but the pressure kept building. Eventually, he gave in. The scandal exploded across the news networks within hours. Fans who once cheered his name now cursed it. Sponsors abandoned him. The league banned him permanently. Michael Carter went from a rising star to a disgrace overnight. His future was gone. For weeks, he wandered the city, avoiding public places. Every screen still replayed the footage of his ruined career. One evening, he found himself standing inside the Metropolis Space Museum, staring at exhibits of ancient heroes from centuries past. One display in particular caught his eye. It showed artifacts from the Age of Heroes. Among them were relics connected to the legendary Superman and the other heroes of the 20th and 21st centuries. A tour robot rolled nearby, projecting holographic images. During the Age of Heroes, it explained, individuals used courage and power to protect the world. These figures became legends whose names endure centuries later. Michael listened carefully. Legends endure centuries. That word stuck in his mind. His eyes wandered across the exhibit cases. There were devices there too, experimental equipment recovered from the hero era, a Legion flight ring prototype, a protective energy suit, historical weapons, artifacts. Security in the museum wasn't designed to stop someone desperate enough. Late that night, Michael returned. He broke into the exhibit vault and stared at the items inside. His hands trembled. "This is crazy," he muttered, but then he thought about the ruined headlines. The shame, the life that was already destroyed. What if I could start over? Not here, but in the past. He grabbed the Legion flight ring, the energy suit, and several advanced gadgets. Then he accessed a display explaining one final artifact stored beneath the museum. A time machine. It had been recovered decades earlier, but never fully understood. Michael stared at the controls. "If I go back," he whispered, "no one will know who I am." But if he arrived with future technology, he could become a hero, or at least look like one. He powered up the machine. Energy crackled across the room. Warning lights flashed. "Temporal displacement sequence activated," the computer announced. Michael Carter took a deep breath. No more disgrace. No more failure. When they write history, they'll remember me. The machine exploded with light. Time around him as the centuries unraveled. When the glow faded, the machine crashed into a deserted industrial district in the past. Smoke rose from the wreckage. Michael climbed out slowly, wearing the advanced combat suit and clutching the Legion flight ring. Above him stretched the unfamiliar skyline of the 21st century. Cars rolled along the streets, police sirens echoed in the distance. This was the era of heroes. And Michael Carter had just arrived. He activated the flight ring experimentally. The ring lifted him into the air. He laughed out loud as he soared above the city. I did it! Hovering over the skyline, he looked down at the unaware world below. He needed a name, something that sounded heroic, something flashy, something people would never forget. Michael grinned. Ladies and gentlemen, get ready for Shah Booster Gold. Below him, a bank alarm suddenly blared. Perfect timing. Booster Gold shot downward toward the chaos, ready to begin the heroic career he had always dreamed of. Not because he was noble, not because he was brave, but because he wanted something the future had already taken from him: fame. And in the beginning, that was more than enough. To be continued. Hackup, The Arkham Stories number 6, Questions Beyond Gotham. A television flickered in the common room of Arkham Asylum. Patients shuffled around the room under the watchful eyes of orderlies while the evening news played loudly. The anchor spoke with urgency. Today in international news, Green Lantern Hal Jordan assisted Wonder Woman in stopping the sorceress Circe after a magical disturbance near the Mediterranean coast. Authorities say the battle caused severe structural damage, but no civilian casualties. The footage showed flashes of green light streaking across the sky, while Wonder Woman battled mystical creatures conjured by Circe. An Arkham orderly sighed. Must be nice living somewhere with heroes like that. A man sitting quietly in the corner smirked slightly. Edward Nygma, or as Gotham knew him, Riddler. Part 1. Notes. There was a time when Edward Nygma grew tired of Gotham. For years, he obsessed over riddles, puzzles, and proving his intellectual superiority over everyone around him. But Gotham had become repetitive. The same criminals, the same dark streets, the same bat-shaped shadow interfering with his plans. So Edward decided to test himself somewhere new. He left Gotham and traveled across the country. His first stop was Metropolis. The shining city fascinated him. It was clean, bright, optimistic, everything Gotham was not. But it also had something Gotham didn't. A god. Edward quickly learned about the city's protector, Superman. To Edward, that sounded like the ultimate challenge. But he knew he couldn't challenge someone like that alone, so he sought out someone else who had a grudge against Metropolis, a woman who could command electricity itself. Livewire. The partnership was simple. Livewire would cause chaos across the city's power grid, while Edward constructed elaborate puzzles that would force Superman into traps. At least, that was the plan. It didn't last long. Superman dismantled the operation within hours. His speed made Edward's traps nearly meaningless, and Livewire's attacks were neutralized almost immediately. Edward was arrested before his third riddle had even been broadcast. After a brief stay in a Metropolis holding facility, he was transferred back toward Gotham. But Edward wasn't finished exploring. During transport, he managed to manipulate the situation enough to reroute himself through Central City. Another hero lived there, another test, another puzzle, the Flash. Edward prepared an elaborate series of riddles scattered across the city. Unfortunately for him, the Flash solved them in minutes, not because the riddles were easy, but because the Flash moved faster than Edward could execute the plan. Within seconds, Edward was tied up, disarmed, and delivered directly to authorities. Shortly after that, he was transported back where Gotham's criminals always seemed to end up, Arkham Asylum. Part 2, The Interview. Inside a quiet observation room, Hugo Strange sat across from Edward. A recorder clicked on. Edward, Strange began calmly, I understand you've had experiences outside Gotham. Tell me about Metropolis. Edward leaned back in his chair with a bored expression. Ah, yes, the shiny city of hope. Bright skies, smiling citizens, and one flying alien babysitting the entire population. Strange scribbled notes. You encountered Superman. Edward rolled his eyes. Encountered? Hardly. More like briefly inconvenienced. He tapped his temple. I partnered with Livewire. Brilliant concept, really. Electricity disruptions, citywide puzzles, forcing the Cape Boy Scout to think rather than punch. Strange asked. And the result? Edward sighed. He moved too fast. Not physically. Well, yes, physically, but mentally too. Annoyingly perceptive. Strange looked intrigued. So you consider him intelligent? Edward frowned. I consider him efficient. Strange flipped a page in his notebook. And Central City? Edward groaned. Oh, that was embarrassing. Strange raised an eyebrow. Embarrassing? Edward nodded. The man runs faster than logic itself. I had riddles hidden across half the city. Timers, puzzles, clues that required deduction. He leaned forward. He solved them all before my monologue finished. Strange paused. So the Flash defeated you quickly? Edward looked irritated. Quickly? Doctor, the entire encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Strange couldn't hide a small smile. Edward noticed. Don't look so pleased, Doctor, Strange asked. What did you learn from these experiences? Edward folded his hands thoughtfully. I learned something very important. Strange leaned forward. And what is that? Edward smiled slowly. Gotham may be insane, But at least the bat plays fair. The recorder clicked off. Outside the interview room, thunder rolled over Gotham City, and somewhere in the darkness above Arkham, Batman watched. The Arkham Stories number 7, The War of Jokes and Riddles. The television in the main lobby of Arkham Asylum buzzed with the evening news. Orderlies stood nearby while several patients sat quietly watching the screen. The news anchor spoke quickly as footage rolled. Across the country today, several major criminal operations have been disrupted. In Metropolis, vigilante Black Lightning, Jefferson Pierce, assisted local authorities in shutting down a weapons distribution network connected to the criminal organization Intergang. The screen shifted to a chaotic scene in Gotham City. Meanwhile, here in Gotham, the masked vigilante known as Batman has reportedly dismantled a smuggling ring run by crime boss Penguin. Authorities say Penguin was taken into custody earlier today. Another segment appeared. And in other unusual news, controversial television journalist Creeper Jack Ryder was seen assisting police during a confrontation with Intergang members earlier this afternoon. The television cut to commercials. Nahar Part 1. The Corridor. The halls of Arkham were dim and quiet. The only sound echoing through the long corridor was the steady tapping of dress shoes against tile. Hugo Strange walked slowly down the hallway, clipboard tucked under his arm. Edward Nygma had been returned to Arkham only days earlier after his latest misadventure outside Gotham. Naturally, Strange had arranged for a new interview. As Strange moved deeper into the cell block, he passed several familiar residents. One of the first cells contained Dr. Death. The villain sat perfectly still on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. His breathing was slow and deliberate, almost mechanical. Strange glanced briefly at him, but kept walking. Further down the corridor, another figure stirred. A face formed out of clay against the bars of the cell. It shifted and reshaped until it resembled a theatrical mask. Inside the cell sat Clayface, Basil Carlo. Carlo grinned as Strange passed. "Soon, Director?" Carlo said dramatically, his voice echoing slightly as his face shifted shapes. "I will have the performance of a lifetime." His arms stretched slightly, forming the shape of a stage curtain before melting back into normal form. "Just you wait and see the show, Strange." Hugo Strange paused briefly, but showed no emotion. "Your performances are rarely as impressive as you believe, Mr. Carlo." Then he continued down the corridor. At the end of the hall sat a newly secured cell. Inside was Riddler. Edward Nygma was already waiting. Part 2. The Interview. The interview room was quiet, except for the soft hum of a recorder. Edward sat calmly at the table, fingers steepled together, a faint smile on his face. Strange activated the recorder. "Edward, today I would like to discuss something from your earlier years in Gotham." Edward tilted his head. "Oh, which one? I've had many fascinating chapters." Strange adjusted his glasses. "The event known as the War of Jokes and Riddles." Edward chuckled softly. "Ah, that." Strange continued. "Records suggest Gotham's criminal underworld became divided during that time. Some sided with you, others with the Joker, and still others aligned themselves with the Penguin." Edward leaned back in his chair. "Yes, Gotham's most entertaining civil war." Strange asked calmly, "Why did it happen?" Edward tapped the table thoughtfully. "It started with the clown, of course. He didn't say the name, but the implication was obvious. His jokes became tiresome, repetitive, predictable, and I naturally found myself correcting the city's sense of humor." Strange scribbled notes. "So the Joker opposed you?" Edward nodded. Strange continued. "And Penguin?" Edward smirked. "Oh, Oswald always preferred stability, profits, order." Edward leaned forward slightly. "So when the clown and I started tearing Gotham's underworld apart, Penguin simply built his own faction." Strange asked, "How extensive was the conflict?" Edward's eyes lit up slightly. "Oh, it was magnificent, Doctor. Criminals choosing sides, territory battles, elaborate traps, joke-based crimes versus intellectual puzzles." He smiled wider. "Gotham was practically a game board." Strange asked quietly, "And Batman?" Edward laughed softly. The bat spent most of the war trying to stop it. He shrugged. But that's the problem with Gotham, Doctor. Strange looked up from his notes. And what problem is that? Edward leaned closer, his voice almost excited. No matter how much chaos happens, no matter how many wars break out, he always restores order. Edward sat back again, and that makes the game far more interesting. The recorder clicked softly as Strange ended the interview. Thunder rolled again over Gotham, because every story Edward told only hinted at deeper wars yet to come.
A man trashed a store after claiming he caught an employee engaging in inappropriate behavior, turning outrage into destruction.
You weird. How I got it.
A Nigerian woman was forcibly removed from a plane after a chaotic fight with a flight attendant, who she claims grabbed her wig and smashed her phone, turning the flight...
The Arkham Stories number 7.5, An Unfinished Experiment. Night had fallen over Arkham Asylum. Rain struck the tall barred windows, and thunder rolled across the skies Gotham City. Inside Arkham's medical wing, a small laboratory had been prepared. Dim lights flickered above a metal examination chair bolted to the floor. Medical equipment sat neatly on steel trays. Glass vials filled with strange chemical compounds glowed faintly under the fluorescent lights. Standing beside the equipment was Jonathan Crane. At this point in his life, Crane was still known primarily as a doctor and psychologist. Officially, he was conducting psychological research on Arkham's inmates. Unofficially, he was testing something far more dangerous. Across the room sat Riddler, his wrists loosely restrained to the arms of the chair. Edward Nygma looked more annoyed than afraid. Crane adjusted his glasses while writing something on a clipboard. Edward, Crane said calmly, this experiment will help us better understand the neurological responses of highly intelligent criminals when confronted with their deepest fears. Edward rolled his eyes. Doctor, if you intend to bore me to death with psychology lectures, at least have the courtesy to make them shorter. Crane ignored the remark. On the tray beside him sat a small vial filled with swirling green gas. Crane lifted it carefully. This compound, he said, stimulates the fear centers of the human brain. It forces the subject to confront subconscious anxieties and hidden phobias. Edward glanced at the vial. So, hallucinations? In simplified terms, Crane replied. Edward smirked slightly. You believe fear reveals truth? Crane nodded slowly. Yes. Edward leaned back in the chair as much as the restraints allowed. That's adorable. Crane raised an eyebrow. Explain. Edward tapped the side of his head. Fear is irrational, Doctor. Chaos. Instinct. It clouds the mind. He smiled confidently. My mind does not cloud. Crane studied him carefully. That is precisely what we're about to test. Crane moved toward the chair with the vial, preparing to release a measured dose of the gas. But before he could begin, alarms blared. Red emergency lights suddenly flashed across the laboratory walls. A loudspeaker crackled overhead. Security alert! Security alert! Patient escape in progress. Crane froze. Edward blinked. The announcement continued. All staff report to emergency positions. Repeat, patient escape in progress. Crane sighed quietly. Edward raised an eyebrow. Well, that's inconvenient. Moments later, the loudspeaker delivered the final update. Escaped inmate identified as Joker. Edward groaned loudly. Oh, for the love of logic. Crane carefully placed the vial back onto the tray. Unfortunately, Mr. Nygma, he said calmly, Arkham's current situation requires my immediate attention. Edward smirked. Let me guess. The clown. Crane began gathering his notes. Yes. Edward shook his head. That man has the worst timing in Gotham. Security guards rushed down the hallway outside the laboratory. The sound of running footsteps and shouting echoed through the building. Crane unlocked Edward's restraints. This experiment will have to be postponed. Edward stood up slowly, stretching his arms. A shame, Doctor. I was almost curious what your little fear gas would do. Crane gave him a long, analytical look. Perhaps one day we will find out. Edward smiled faintly. Perhaps. Crane turned off the laboratory lights and exited into the chaos of Arkham's corridors as guards scrambled to contain the latest breakout. Edward remained alone in the room for a moment. He glanced once more at the vial of swirling green toxin sitting on the metal tray. Then he chuckled softly. Fear? Really? He walked out of the laboratory. The experiment had never happened. The toxin had never touched him. And our Riddler would leave Arkham exactly the same as he entered, unaffected, untested, tested, and still convinced his mind was the sharpest weapon in Gotham. Somewhere in the asylum, alarms continued to scream, because the Joker was loose again, and that meant another long night for Batman.
A man refusing mask rules in Tucson. AZ melts down in public and ends up being escorted out by his son. A woman dubbed Karen stood in front of a bus and punched the front window.
The Arkham Stories number 8, The Designer's Offer. Opening, the news. The television inside Arkham Asylum buzzed with another evening broadcast. Patients and guards alike watched the screen as the anchor spoke over dramatic footage of a massive battle. Earlier today, a major criminal alliance was dismantled after Superman and Wonder Woman teamed up with members of the Teen Titans to stop a coordinated attack involving several supervillains. Footage played of heroes fighting across a destroyed industrial district. Authorities confirmed the villains involved were Toymen, Cheetah, and Dr. Light, along with the Titans' enemies, Cinderblock, and Plasmus. Officials say the heroes prevented what could have been catastrophic damage. The television switched to a commercial as Arkham's dim halls fell quiet again. Notes. Sometime after the brutal conflict known as the War of Jokes, Riddles, and Penguins, Gotham's criminal underworld slowly returned to its normal patterns. The chaos had burned itself out. Territories were reestablished, old rivalries cooled, and two of the most dangerous minds in Gotham eventually returned to the streets once again, Joker and Riddler. Surprisingly, the two criminals appeared to set aside their earlier hostilities. The war that once divided Gotham's villains became little more than history. Not long after, several major Gotham criminals were approached by a mysterious new figure, a man known only as the Designer. The Designer claimed to be a master architect of crime. His reputation spread quickly through Gotham's underworld, a strategist capable of building elaborate criminal operations and traps so perfect they could evade even Batman. The Designer approached 4 of Gotham's most infamous criminals: Riddler, Joker, Penguin, Catwoman. He offered them something extraordinary. He would design their greatest schemes, perfect crimes tailored specifically to their talents. Each villain made a request. The Penguin asked for financial empires and influence over Gotham's elite. Catwoman requested high-level heists that would challenge even her skills. The Joker, naturally, simply wanted chaos. But the Riddler had a more specific demand. Edward Nygma asked for unlimited access to death traps. He wanted elaborate puzzle-based devices designed specifically to torment and defeat the Gotham City Police Department. The Designer accepted the requests. Plans were drawn, blueprints created. The foundations of Gotham's greatest criminal conspiracy began forming. But the partnership did not last. The Joker, growing bored with the structured nature of the Designer's plans, disrupted the entire arrangement. In a violent confrontation, the Joker seemingly killed the Designer. The alliance collapsed immediately. To erase all evidence of the meeting and the plans, the villains burned down the Designer's headquarters. By the time authorities arrived, nothing remained but ashes. The perfect crimes had never begun. Part 3, the interview inside Arkham. Hugo Strange sat across from Edward Nygma once again. The recorder clicked on. Edward, Strange began calmly. Today I want to discuss the events following the War of Jokes and Riddles. Edward sat comfortably in the chair, arms folded. Oh yes, Gotham's brief experiment in organized insanity. Strange continued. You and several other criminals were approached by someone calling himself the Designer. Edward smirked. Ah, the architect of crime. Very ambitious man. Strange adjusted his glasses. What exactly did he offer you? Edward leaned forward slightly. Perfection. Strange waited. Edward continued. He claimed he could design flawless crimes, elaborate operations that would outthink the police, outmaneuver the Bat, and elevate us beyond simple street criminals. Strange wrote quickly. And your request? Edward's smile widened. I asked for death traps. Strange looked up. Specifically, Edward tapped his fingers together. Machines of logic, Doctor. Devices that force victims to solve puzzles or face consequences, something worthy of my intellect. Strange nodded. And yet the plan failed. Edward sighed dramatically. Yes, because of the clown. Strange raised an eyebrow. You believe the Joker intentionally sabotaged the Alliance? Edward scoffed. Of course he did. Edward leaned back. The designer wanted structure, precision, strategy. He shook his head. The Joker despises those things. Strange asked quietly. So the Joker killed the designer? Edward shrugged. Seemingly. Strange paused before asking the final question. And the destruction of the headquarters? Edward smiled calmly. Oh, that was simple. Strange waited. Edward replied softly. No evidence, no plans, no witnesses. The room fell quiet. Strange stopped writing. Edward's eyes gleamed slightly. Doctor, he said with a small grin, if you're going to plan the perfect crime, you must also plan the perfect ending. The recorder clicked off. Outside Arkham, lightning flashed across the skies of Gotham City. And somewhere in the darkness, Batman continued watching.